Welcome to Your Next Tech Startup. I'm host Isabel Rasmussen, and today I have an engineering leader sharing hiring stories, Philip Gollucci. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Isabel. Happy to be here. I've been in the technology space for pretty much my whole life and have been hiring people pretty much that whole time, but as a senior leader for about the last 15 years.
Mhm.
I've been across all industries, domains, and have worked with teams roughly from one at some small startups all the way up to 400.
So, for today's conversation, you'd share stories that ideally will help people who are early on their journey around hiring to kind of think differently about hiring. Also, I think it's always helpful for people who are interviewing to kind of understand what the hiring manager is potentially dealing with and thinking about.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay,
Do it.
awesome. All right, first question. Was there a candidate that you almost rejected but ended up hiring, and what changed your mind?
Good question. There's actually more than one, but I'll tell a specific story. A lot of people want to make career changes, and that doesn't mean they're bad hires. So I like referrals. It's very good for hiring managers to get referrals because they're what we like to call a known quantity. Like you have a reasonable expectation of what they're going to do. But it's even better when they're switching careers. I actually have rejected someone because I didn't realize that they were a referral and the resume didn't match the job description. I
And the
later
job was for a
this,
DevOps role, is that right?
this particular job was for a DevOps engineer working in the cloud space.
And they more of like a full stack engineer?
Older school software engineering. I don't know if I would say full stack in this particular case.
So it was more they just like hadn't adopted modern technologies.
They had not yet worked in the cloud.
Okay. Yeah, and then going into DevOps role.
Yeah, so that was a pretty big leap to be like, oh, you want to go work where your primary job is cloud, but you have no cloud experience,
Yeah, I hate to say it, but I would have rejected.
which I did reading the resume, and I didn't realize it was a referral. And then a couple days later, got the WTF. That's someone I know. I referred them. They can do this job. And so I was like, okay, let's go interview this person because if I get a referral, I will almost guarantee you'll get an interview, even if we don't end up hiring you, because I like to put that much stock in referrals. Now I might not hire you. At any rate, the thing that this person did, let's call him Joe, that impressed me was he actually was able to learn in the middle of the interview, right? Like he was able to map things that I might ask about, like what would you do, the things he had already done in a different space. Like he could give examples of similar work. He actually learned real fast. He got certified, he started teaching others, and as a result of all that, he got promoted in just 11 short months.
And I think that's such a great example of hiring for potential, which is really hard to do that outside of the referral network. You can take so many gambles, I guess. And I think for people hearing this story, really thinking about as a hiring manager, people get afraid of taking gambles and they get stuck on you have to know this exact thing versus your ability to learn, which is, as a recruiter, incredibly frustrating and hard for people when they want to make moves. And then, but also for people who are job seeking right now, really thinking about how to utilize your referral network because it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, you have to know some of the fundamentals, but pretty much anything outside of that can be taught. Even fundamentals can be taught, but the most frequent thing I see people miss is actual fundamentals. And it turns out good software engineering is good software engineering.
And now, when I hear fundamentals, I sometimes think that it is like kind of code for we're making sure that they have a CS degree.
Absolutely not. I could
Okay.
put no less stock in having CS degrees. The field changes so rapidly right now. Like what you learned in college is going to be obsolete in 6 months, regardless of when you're graduating.
So when you say fundamentals, like what are a couple things that you've like when you're thinking, does this person have the fundamentals? What does that mean?
A lot of people will ask you to do esoteric things like write leak code or hacker rank algorithms that you'll never actually use in your job. I have never once needed to know the answer to a single one of those questions in my 28 years of technology at any level. What I mean by fundamentals is like, what's something that you will most likely do 100 times a day, 5 days a week, 30 days a month, 365 days a year, so that you've literally done it 30,000 times or so in 1 year. That's a
Okay.
fundamental. And that will actually
Okay.
make us, a place to build.
So what would the interview question be?
It depends on what jobs you're interviewing for. It might be like, show me how you set up your laptop so that you can do your job. Or a bunch
Okay.
of people that say, I program whatever language. And they might actually be really good at programming that language, but if you don't actually help them set up their laptop, they can't actually do anything. They just sit there
Okay.
and they're like, oh, it doesn't work. Which to me is like learning to drive before you learn how to steer your car.
Okay. Yeah, I know I've like seen interviews where it's like something like set up like a hello world or something like that.
It's like showing me that you know how to optimize the computer that you work on to make your life easy. Right? Like use the tools that are in front
Okay.
of you. Another way you can say it is languages have spoken languages have idioms. There's common
Mhm.
phrases that you say a lot, patterns of words that repeat that are short. The same thing is true in technology. There are idioms that are very common in various cultures or programming languages that you would just expect. Like it's how you speak the language, and anyone that actually spent any time in the language would know the idioms.
All right, I'm going to switch to our next question. So, tell me about the best hiring decision you have ever made, which I mean, you've made hundreds of them. So, the best, and what made that person stand out? What's memorable about that?
A lot of times, people are expected to be technical at every level. And I do think a lot of people should be technical, but there is definitely room in most fields, including SaaS and B2B and things like that, where you don't actually need to be the most technical person in the room and you don't need to spend a fraction of your time writing code. What I was coming from was a place where the directors, the managers, the senior managers were all spending too much time actually writing code. So that causes a bunch of problems. One, you don't actually spread your knowledge out, so you create single points of failure. It was a big cultural shift for this company for me. Like, hey, let's hire someone that can't code, so that there's no chance we can fall into that trap. Because what we really need is someone to grow the team, to have empathy, to develop soft skills, which are one of the major shortcomings right now.
And now, just to clarify, so someone who can't code, but was this like an engineering manager hire, or what was the title?
It was an engineering manager hire. Yes,
So,
can't code might be
okay,
too
I'm
strong of
like,
a
what is
word.
their background if they can't code?
Having been in and around technology for previous years and
Okay.
it
Okay. So at one time they did
other
code.
technology that we don't use.
Okay. So then the interview process obviously has to look very different
Yeah.
to, and you probably had something that you'd have to do a lot of pre-brief and like giving very specific directions on how this interview needs to be conducted, because otherwise people are going to go to, well, this is how I believe this should work and the type of person we should hire. So
Mhm.
tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. Interview processes vary so wildly. One of the number one things people screw up is they don't align on what they're looking for. Or even if they all want to look for different things so that they cover as broad a case as possible. And a lot of people that interview are not like me and probably you. They haven't done 1,000 interviews or hired 100 people. Like they might be interviewing for their first or second time. And
Yeah.
so there's also all different kinds of interviews, right? You can do a tech interview, a case study interview, which is actually cross calibrated, behavioral questions. And so what we really aligned on is like what we want are soft skills. We want someone that can help grow people across career ladders. And from that, what I like to do for most interviews is develop a set of questions. We call them the question bank at my current company. And that way we at least ask the same questions consistently. We came
Mhm.
up with get a slacking employee promoted, or think about a time where you dealt with a egocentric top performer, or tell me about a time when your engineer disagreed with product management.
Those are all great questions. Now, I'm still just like, I've ran so many hiring processes, and the concept of hiring anybody into an engineering team and them not having to do one technical interview is like, there's no world that I believe that that happened. Did you really not, what's the most interesting project that you've worked on, like accomplishments, kind of career accomplishments outside of managing great and not great employees dynamics?
Well, we obviously had their resume, so we could see a little of that. And we asked them to talk about like what environments they've been in. Like, was it an agile environment? Was it a waterfall environment? Like, what was your
Okay.
team size? What's your day to day look like? I
But no,
personally
like,
be like, do you use Amazon Web Services? That question didn't come up, and I certainly wasn't like, you tell me how to do this in Amazon.
okay, so you ran non an interview process with no technical interviews to hire an engineering manager. And what happened?
Well, the candidate did really well. They were actually able to quote some books in the interview, such as Crucial Conversations. A lot of people go through their technical career or their career in general, and they don't know what to read. They don't know who to model themselves after. A lot of it's actually like cult knowledge that people assume you've read the books, but you actually haven't. To hear someone actually quote books as examples to you in an interview of why they would make the decisions they do, that's just,
Mhm.
I found a
Yeah.
gold mine.
An excellent people leader, then, and I know you as an individual really like the demonstration of passion beyond the 9 to 5. I know you're really into open source. And so for this person, clearly they're reading the books on people management. They're curious in that space. That's where their headspace is. And so, yeah, you're looking for that.
Yeah, there's the classic trade-off, right? Or where you spend your time, you're giving up time somewhere else,
Yeah.
right? It's really hard to be good at everything all at once. And like if you're learning people skills, you obviously don't have as much time to learn technical skills. And if you're learning technical skills, you don't have as much time to learn people skills. Now, I wouldn't
Yeah.
recommend everybody go hire a non-technical manager, but we were sinking in technical managers at the time that couldn't do that.
Yeah, so it's like looking at what your organization has and what it's lacking, and so
Yes.
creating and so how did that work out?
This person also got promoted after the 1 year mark to the day. So
And are you
that went
still in
well.
contact?
Yes,
And are they still a engineering people leader?
they are currently a director, moved up from
Okay.
manager.
All right, we will move to the next question. So have you ever made a hire that you thought was gonna be perfect and then it didn't work out? And what did you feel like you missed in the interview process?
I definitely have, probably more than I would hope to admit. I know Jeff Bezos would probably kill me because he puts so much stock and did so much personal interviewing when Amazon was young. But it happens. Not everyone is Jeff. So I've been in some places where some roles needed very specific things. Like there was a very specific skill set or specific piece of technology that we didn't have. In some cases, a piece of technology you're actually phasing out as well. So we
Um,
actually over optimized our interview process to find that. And we just kind of accepted on face value that they had a bunch of other skills that were actually on their resume that you would typically need to work here. I've worked at a bunch of, in this case, Rails startups. I think it's my fifth one now. But this
uh-huh.
person had a specific piece of technology, which I can't say because it'll identify said person. And then they also needed to know Rails and it turns out they had had a job for like 5 years at a Rails startup writing Rails code. And so we're like,
Uh-huh.
okay, we're going to assume that they probably know at least some Rails. Let's focus on making sure they know the thing that we actually need right now. Turns out they did know the thing that we needed right now. But unfortunately, when that thing actually did get phased out, they didn't know Rails at all. It was like they were seeing it for the first time. And it just didn't get caught in the process because they were over focused on that one thing.
Right, so you assume that they knew
Their act-
Ruby.
we assume that they knew their actual day job, right? Previous
Right.
job for 5 years was at a Rails company writing Rails, and we just assume like, okay, you know Rails, at least some.
The requirements for the role. So, like, depth of understanding in Ruby on Rails is one requirement, and then technology Y was another requirement, and then there's the other couple things that like float around with that. There, all your candidates should go through those interviews,
Mhm.
regardless of. I like to believe that you can believe what's on somebody's resume and that we conduct ourselves in like a space of let's assume the best versus let's assume the worst, because that makes the interview experience so uninviting when you come from an let's assume the worst space, but you still need to kind of have your checks and balances. So would you say that that was the like what did you miss on interview process? I'm
Oh,
assuming like your checks and balances weren't there.
this was a big miss. We definitely screwed this up, and as the head, I definitely dropped the ball here. What we should have done was added a section for the specific piece of technology and done the normal thing. We
Oh,
did
okay.
the sections all for the specific piece of technology, and we just missed it because we weren't paying attention
So you,
out of it. Like,
right, you don't want to double the amount of interviews the person has to go through.
yeah,
I
I'm
mean,
a
that's
pretty
great.
stickler for long interview processes, right? So like if we're talking to more than like four people, I get antsy because it just
Yeah.
doesn't help and it drags it out. And like nowadays, someone will take another offer anyway if you take too long.
But it is a great example to earlier hiring managers because you had been probably hiring quite a bit at this point. It's kind of like you got a little bit tunnel visioned on the one thing and then making sure the core is being covered. I do think if you have the right recruiting partner and they really understand the role, I know I've gone back and been like, wait, what are we not?
It's impossible to make good hiring decisions if you don't have a good recruiting partner and if they don't know enough about what they're hiring for that you can talk to them with the right words and so they can do the
Yeah,
right filtering. Actually, I had a great recruiting partner. It literally everyone in the process tunneled in on that one thing because it was our very acute need and we wanted the process to go really quickly. I think it took,
yeah.
I mean, we did interview a bunch of candidates, but I think we made this offer within like 2 or 3 weeks flat.
Okay. Yeah. Well, great learning and, no pain, no gain.
We were able to recover, move some resources around, and then
Were they a good person that was able, like, right, with the right sources to be successful? Or, I mean, there's also, I'm just like, how can you be in a job for 5 years that the, like, everything's built on Ruby and Rails and not know Ruby on Rails? Like,
I have the same question. I really do.
did
They
you ask them?
sort of. What
Yeah.
struck me in some of my reports was the inability or undesire of this person to actually ask for help.
Yeah.
That interview for sure. Like that wasn't something we figured out.
Yeah, I've talked to hiring managers over the years. There's this complicated balance between not trying to figure something out on your own before asking for help. That is not a good hire. And then the other side of that, where they go down a rabbit hole or are unable to ask for support. You need to find that person who takes 10 minutes to try to figure it out. If you can't figure it out at the set time, then let's jump on a call or let's Slack about it or whatever. And so figuring out what your engineering culture is, how you handle that and screening for it.
For sure. All the things I wish I
Yeah.
knew.
So I'm happy that we're having this conversation because I think that is this really hard part about hiring is you realize you learn the most through the mistakes you make. And there's so many different things that like you want to try to figure out about a candidate without, objecting them to an absurd amount of interviews. And so it does get really challenging to balance it. And then, back to like that interview process, one of the things that drives me absolutely nuts is the how many people on this team are asking the tell me about yourself question. Like, we like I think that's oftentimes interview teams, everybody's gathering the same 20 to 30% of information. And
Mhm.
if we were sure that we were all gathering different relevant information, we wouldn't have to double the amount of interviews, but we could almost double the amount of information that we learn about the candidate.
Yeah, I actually get this feedback from people that do interviews for me all the time that either they can't see the feedback and that's like obviously a privacy thing and an unbiased reason, but like the
Yeah.
tell me about you question is probably shareable because it's a statement of fact, right? Like I am like this, I'm not like that. I've worked here, I've not worked there. Right. It's just a statement of fact. So that is probably shareable. But what companies end up doing is they just draw a hard line. Either you see everything and you're biased, or you see absolutely nothing.
The ATS systems that kind of create that problem. It is, I think that's a great point. When I think about an agency recruiter will typically send a write-up with their resume. And so, but then that's only shared with like a hiring manager. I love that idea of the, you know, kind of there's like facts versus assumptions. Your recruiter needs to understand how to differentiate the two, and that they write up on the candidate from that initial screen, and then that is shared as part of the interview process with everyone so that get to know you piece goes away. I used to organize interview loops. I would make sure that everybody had different icebreakers. So the icebreaker wasn't tell me about you, and that it somehow could play into the requirements were for the. Okay, let's move on to the next question. We're talking about like great stories that you have, and it is all tying into kind of how complex and hard it is to hire and build good process. Okay, so next question. Tell me about a time that a candidate surprised you in an interview, and it could be was a good surprise or a bad surprise?
I'm not surprised as often as I used to be because I've done so many interviews at this point. I don't know if I said it earlier, but somewhere like 1,000 interviews at this point in my career I've done for various companies. But I am to this I will never forget this. Actually, I have two stories I could tell here. The first one was I was again interviewing for a cloud engineer, and I happen to know a lot about this space because I myself remain technical to this day, and I do a lot with Amazon. So I've taught Amazon, I've taught certifications for Amazon, I've actually written some of the questions for some of the certifications for the exams for Amazon.
Wow.
And when someone says I have this certificate on their resume, and it's like, oh, that's the certificate I actually want you to have. And then you go into the interview and they're like, I have this certificate. And they repeat it as in the tell me about phase. And I'm like, okay, great.
Okay.
Let me ask you a confirming question. And so this is one of my idioms or fundamental questions, and that's why I know it's on the exam. And out of like 60, I can't remember, 60 or 65 questions, it's on there like three times. And it's
Wow.
it's basically how you move code from your laptop to production without
Hmm.
the site going down. And there's names for that in technology like blue green or red black and stuff. And I know this exam asks you about it. This candidate, let's call him John, stared back at me
Hmm.
like I was speaking French or Japanese. Like he had literally never heard of it. And I'm like, how did you pass the exam?
Did you
Obviously,
ask how did you pass the exam?
I didn't say that out loud in the interview. I was just like, okay, let's move
I
on. I have such and such certification, and maybe it had just been a bullet point on his resume, but he had literally just gotten the certification the week prior, which means if you ask
wow.
Amazon if you have a year plus of experience in the field, you probably spent 3 to 6 months studying for the exam, and to have forgotten that in 5 short days is just unfathomable for it to be that core to that job. And to put that amount of time in, I've never heard of it.
I mean, so I guess the reality is you don't need to ask a follow-up question. You know one of two things, and both are bad. One, they are either a liar, and therefore you don't want them on the team, or two, they have such an insanely bad memory that you don't want them on the team. And so interview's over.
Yeah, I actually did go and like you get certification numbers, you can verify certificates, and like the certificate was real. I checked.
Oh my god. Okay, so just worst memory ever, or
I guess, or maybe it was the worst case of interview jitters I've ever seen. But I try not to put too much stock in memory. That's why I try to differentiate fundamentals, right? Like it's
yeah,
something that's fundamental, but you do it rarely. But there's also a fundamental that like I know you do this 50 times a day, every day of your life.
right.
And that's not
Yeah,
something
I'm
I'm
just trying
going to forget.
so you verify that this person granted after the fact that they had the verification. So, what could you have done to calm, let's assume it was nerves, to help them calm their nerves?
I would do is I would try to make some suggestions or try to be like, does this relate to anything else that you've done? Do you have any other examples that are like relevant, or just keep adding context? And so
Yeah,
we
yeah.
did actually go through that series of events. Like it wasn't a like, oh, you don't know, we're done. Like there was a discussion around it first, despite my disbelief.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's so complicated. And then I do know that you rescue dogs, and so I believe that we are hearing some background noise that is just some happy dogs.
Oh, you are actually hearing my dog snore, apparently.
Oh, my dog snores like that sometimes too. Last question. Have you ever broken your own hiring rule for someone, and what happened next?
Very good question. I pay a lot of attention in the senior leadership levels, unfortunately, to sometimes office politics. And sometimes that matters. Like if you know you're going to hire someone that is related to, say, the CEO or the founder, like are they going to listen to the 25 million things the CEO wants you to do, or the one thing that you as the functional lead know you need to do in order to stay in business? And so
Mhm.
at a small company, that's even worse. So this was many, many years ago, but one such occasion actually occurred. We were looking for, I guess at the time we would call them system administrators. I guess today you call them site reliability engineers or DevOps engineers.
Mhm.
And we had the job posted. We had some resumes come in, and that person was referred. And I was like, oh, this it says right on here, like they called it right out, like related, like such and such to the CEO. I just put it in the trash. I didn't even think twice about it because I was worried about it. All the other candidates fizzled. And I was like, well, shit, now I'm going to have to open the job again or just find new candidates, get through all that again. And unsurprisingly, the person reached back out through another contact, and I told the CEO and my boss, because I wasn't reporting to the CEO at the time, my concerns. And they were like, look, don't worry about it. We understand where you're coming from. And I was like, yeah, I'm a little dubious, but I'm going to do it anyway. So I interviewed this
Mhm.
person, and the thing that actually swung me to interview them wasn't what the CEO or other people said. It was, I saw a phrase on the resume that was actually relevant. And the actual phrase was script and go, not the language go,
Mhm.
it just said script and go, which
Mhm.
highlighted to me like where they spent their time to know to say that. And so they got the interview. And to this day, this is still true. Like I tend to ask the same set of questions. I care about the fundamentals when I do technical interviews. Slam
Mhm.
dunk. Every question right. Like to this day, this is probably the only person that's gotten all five questions right.
Huh.
And obviously got hired and
Yeah.
never looked back. We worked together for I want to say 2 or 3 years. They felt so bad that they actually had to take me out to the bar when they decided to take their next job because they were worried. But I actually went to this person's wedding, and we're still friends 15 years later.
Oh, that's really nice. And you know what's funny is we started with a story that, and I think this is just like, again, how complicated it all is, like these like rules that you create. Like we started with a story where you always interview a referral.
Mhm.
And then we
There's
end
an
with a
exception.
story where you were like, well, not that kind of referral.
Yeah, that's why it's a rule, is because there's an exception.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, this has been such a fun conversation. I will do one lightning round last question about you. And what did you want to be when you were a little kid?
Oh, that's easy. I wanted to be an electrical engineer.
So, electrical engineer, but that's, and then how did you switch to software engineering?
How did I switch? I think I ended up switching in college officially. I was started as electrical engineer with a minor in computer science and in classical and
Mhm.
jazz performance. I think I did 3 years worth of electrical engineering. The engineering course was like math, just math. You didn't get to actually build anything into your capstone project your senior year. And I was like, this is silly. I want to actually do something. And when you go through the computer science curriculum, you immediately, the first day you sit down on a course, you get to build like a program. I was like, this is
Huh.
much better.
So nice to have you on as a guest, and I look forward to a future episode with you.
Excellent. This was fun. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Okay.